Hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV. And we are still in the middle of South Asia, or today, in fact, Southeast Asia week on our channel. And we had that amazing show with Kiran last night about Indian heroes in World War II and the lack of interest in India's women in World War II. That was a really cool show. But we're now off to Singapore, not virtually, not literally. And I'm really excited to have tonight's guest because I read one of her books years and years ago. I'm holding up now. There's the new version of it, which we'll talk about later on. But The Heroes of Rimau is one of the books I read. I don't know when it, and I was enthralled by it. And to think that all these years later, I'd now be talking to her and about this operation live on YouTube. I didn't know that would be possible. But anyway, so I'm very pleased to introduce Lynette Silvers, who is a decorated, award-winning Australian historian, detective of history, tour guide, you name it, Lynette has done it. I'm thrilled to have you, Lynette. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. Hello, everybody.
So this operation, like a lot of exciting commando, daredevil type raids of World War II, they end up getting written about a lot and a lot and a lot. And over the years, some of the history can get a little bit muddled and a little bit lost and confused, and myths and things like that. So it's important for people like yourself to kind of go back to the original story and say, look, here's what actually happened, and go from that. So this has been a story that in Australia is better known than it is elsewhere. When did you first get interested in this particular operation?
Oh, back in the mid-80s. I met a fellow who'd done a lot of research on it and was just going to put the research away, and I'd finished another book and said, well, you know, I'm happy to work on it, and it kind of went from that.
And as we said, it has been talked about a lot, and there are various mini-series and TV and films, things about this. But we're going to go back and talk about it from the very beginning. So, to start us off, we were talking before we went live about the whole creation of what we would now call special forces. There was Churchill's plea to set Europe ablaze, and in Europe, SOE gets formed. We have the fledgling commandos doing things in Norway in 1940. The first parachute forces form, things like that. But in Australia, which of course the other side of the world, how was your the first reaction? Australia, of course, sends lots of infantry of it to North Africa. But what was the first kind of idea about a special way of fighting warfare? So it's the SOE, isn't it, in Australia, that starts things off? Is that right?
No, we actually had a group called the Independent Companies, or Commando units, and they were based on the real commando units of South Africa. Get in and hit hard and come out. But we didn't have any clandestine units behind the line until Singapore fell, and SOE Far East, which was an offshoot of SOE, which was actually an offshoot of MI6. The people who got out of Singapore came to Australia, and they suggested setting up SOE Australia. So our version is really an offshoot of SOE Far East, which is an offshoot of SOE in Europe.
So it does get a bit complicated, these various organizations, and this brings us up to, if people are watching this and they go online, they're intrigued by this story, and they go and buy your book, but they go online first, you'll find lots of references to Operation Jaywick and the follow-up operation that talk about the Z-men, the Z-Force, Z-Unit. So let's clear that up right at the beginning, Lynette, because this wasn't actually organized by the Z-Unit. So explain how this kind of myth has got established, and exactly what the history is behind this.
Well, when SOE Australia was set up, because of the large number of Australians who were recruited to this unit, they decided they needed a special holding unit which could administer to the Australian Army component. Now, this didn't involve people like Ivan Lyon, who was English, or anyone in the Navy, or anyone in the Air Force. It was purely the AIF, Australian Imperial Force. It was purely an administrative body, couldn't do anything except administer. And for some reason, they called it Z Special Unit, and the Australian Army were posted to it for administrative purposes. Now, the term Z-Force, Z-Men, all that sort of thing did not come into the popular area until well into the 1960s, when people who had been with Special Operations Australia, as it was later, realised that they were part of this Z Special Unit. And for some reason, the administrative body then became the operational side. And as that went on, the mythology grew. Ex-service people who'd been with Special Operations decided to create a logo with a dagger through a Z. That morphed into a Z for Zorro type Z, and it's just gone from there. And now we have the term Z Force, which was coined in the 1970s by a man who claimed he was with Special Operations Australia and invented an entirely fictitious background for himself, but was actually a cook with an RAAF construction company and had absolutely nothing to do with Special Operations. And while he was the president of the society, he endorsed B-grade movies as being entirely factual, and that really started the ball rolling with this mythology.
So the actual unit that is responsible, which doesn't have quite as zingy a name, and I can completely understand why Z-Men, Z-Force, it kind of rolls off the tongue very well, was the Services Reconnaissance Department, which sounds a little bit less exciting than Z-Force, especially when you bring Zorro into it. But this is the organization we're actually talking about. So who exactly were they then?
Well, SOE Australia, the first one, was actually called Inter-Allied Services Department, which was its cover name. Then that was disbanded. They had problems with it, and it re-emerged as SOA, Special Operations Australia. And they had a new cover name, which was Services Reconnaissance Department, or SRD. And it was to SRD that Z Special Unit administered the Australian Army component, and that's the link. But the only memorial in Australia that was put up fairly early that has the right terminology is one over in Western Australia, and it's called the Services Reconnaissance Department Memorial. And it's the only one, the rest have got Zs all over them.
And as we'll see that later in, folks, there's a couple of monuments we'll show you photos of later that have this Z unit, Z force. And we've now established that's incorrect in terms of who is in charge of this force. So there's the first myth busted. And we always like on World War II TV to bust a few myths. So, and Lynette, I've noticed in my chats with her, is very quick to correct me when I get things wrong. And that's good. That's what I want. I do not know everything. I'm a jack of all trades. I'm talking about the Pacific Theatre one week, ETO next week, aviation, and I need to be kept in check and told when I've got things wrong. So that's good. So let's go to the actual operation itself, and let's bring in, you mentioned him earlier on, Ivan Lyon, who at various points of the war went up through the ranks. When he died, he was Lieutenant Colonel. But introduce us. So you say he wasn't Australian, he was English. So what's his background?
Yes, he was from a very long line of military people in England who covered themselves in glory in the First World War, and he was English. He joined as a regular before the war, went to Sandhurst, and was sent out to Singapore with the Gordon Highlanders. Now, while he was out there, he was recruited by MI6. MI6 had people on the payroll who were what we'd call spies, but they had a lot of other people working for them, sending information, doing all sorts of things, whom I call friends of MI6, and Ivan Lyon was one of them. When the Japanese, came to Singapore and it looked like things were getting very sticky, SOE Far East was formed, and he became a member of that. And consequently, before the fall, he went down through the islands south of Singapore to set up an escape route with other people to allow, originally it was going to be a system to bring goods in and out of Singapore, but as Singapore went in such a great hurry, it became an escape route. And that is where, while he was down on the Indragiri River organising this escape route, he met another member of MI6. Now, this member of MI6 was an Australian called Bill Reynolds, a mining engineer, and he'd been spying for MI6 since the First World War, probably. The other person in this story was a fellow called Dennis Emerson Elliott, who was a great friend of Lyon. They were almost neighbours in Singapore. Lyon went to Dennis's wedding, and Dennis was a long-term spy for MI6. He'd been with them for a very long time, and he was a professional spy. When the Japanese attacked Singapore on the 8th of December 1941, Dennis was sent off to impound any Japanese fishing boats that were in port. And one of the ships he impounded was a scruffy little boat that had its engine was shot, apparently, called the Kofuku Maru. And that was the ship which Dennis's friend Bill Reynolds, also MI6, liberated and took down to Sumatra with refugees and people to escape from Singapore. And on the Indragiri River, Bill Reynolds met up with Ivan Lyon. So now we have an unholy trio here. Lyon, Reynolds and Emerson Elliott all working in some capacity for MI6, and all are men of empire.
And it's just worth mentioning, because when Damien Lewis was on a show a few weeks ago, talking about the early days of MI6, SOE, SAS in Great Britain, it's a lot about who you know, not what you know. There is an old boys network, and it's so often you read these stories of one person knows someone else who then knows, because of course you can't recruit for secret organizations by putting adverts in newspapers, wanted spies, wanted people to work behind the lines. So it's really fascinating, the early origins of just because you're known by someone else and you've got the requisite kind of skills. And all these people, to a certain extent, they're not renegades, but they think outside of the box, don't they? They're the kind of people who have ideas outside of. I know Lyon has been to Sandhurst, but he's not necessarily a product of Sandhurst in that kind of way. He's traveled, he's been in different parts of the world. And he and Emerson Elliott and Bill Reynolds, they've got that kind of look on the warfare of trying to think the same way the enemy thinks, in a sense, guerrilla warfare, doing things that are unusual. And that's important to the founding of these organizations. So we'll move on to the boat itself. And, we mentioned this is the Kite, as it became named later. So tell us about the boat.
Well, it was made in Japan and belonged to a Japanese fishing company, and they had lots of these little boats, all exactly the same, very, very, very similar. And it had been fishing in the waters off Singapore and had engine trouble, and so was in port when the Japanese attacked, and Emerson Elliott impounded it. Now, I think people listening in might be interested to know that Emerson Elliott had a secret number, BB007, and yes, same as Ian Fleming's fictitious James Bond, and Emerson Elliott's very good friend was in fact Ian Fleming.
Which is another interesting topic, because I talked about this with Lynette when we did our pre-chat. This another candidate for who is the inspiration for James Bond, and we've tackled loads of these over these, and you see them. But you've made a very good strong case. Same number, 007, friend of Ian Fleming. That there is a strong Bond inspiration behind this figure there. But we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, because we're here to talk about real history, not fictitious history. Although Ian Fleming will be coming back into our stories in August, of course, when David O'Keefe is back on, folks, to talk about Dieppe on the anniversary of the Dieppe raid, because of course Ian Fleming, naval commander, is involved in the whole Pinch raid enigma. We'll do all that next month. But fascinating that this story brings in such interesting characters, because each one of these people we talk about is deserving in some ways of their own show, isn't it? I mean, you could do an entire show about what some of these people do and got up to in the war. It's really amazing stuff. But back to the Kite, and then another photo of it here. So the thing is, Ivan Lyon, when he sees this, is it him who has the idea about Singapore? Is it Bill Reynolds? This is where it gets a bit complicated.
They literally bumped into each other. Lyon had just arrived up on the Indragiri River, having finished directing people up there to escape, and he bumped into this little Japanese fishing boat, because Bill Reynolds had been rescuing people who'd been bombed out in the Banker Straits, and had been bringing them in to put them onto this lifeline that Lyon and his friends had set up. So that's where they initially met. And Lyon could not believe that Bill Reynolds was still alive, because pretty much every vessel on the water had been blown out of the water by Japanese planes or surface craft. And the reason that Bill Reynolds was still alive was the fact that he was on a Japanese fishing boat. So when Lyon found out that Bill Reynolds had got out of Singapore and had been doing all this rescue work unmolested, he said, if you can get out of Singapore, we can both get back in. And that's where the idea came, if they could both survive the next part of their life, the next few weeks, that they would return to Singapore and they would attack enemy shipping and restore some of the prestige that the British had lost over the loss of Singapore.
And this is, again, we just to mention, we talked about Port Moresby in New Guinea a few weeks ago. We've talked about other important, but Singapore is both a literal important place for, port, harbour, but it's also symbolic as well, isn't it? When the British fell there, relatives from my family, people from my part of the world in East Anglia, stepping straight off the boat in prisoner of war camps in Singapore. Not a great hour in British and Commonwealth history, Singapore. And the Japanese are gloating over the fact they now control Singapore, which brings us, of course, to Operation Jaywick, and we will turn on that, of course, get into more detail about later on. But when Ivan Lyon has this idea about going, the Kite can travel unmolested, it's got a chance of getting through the lines, is his thinking about Singapore as being a big destructive raid, or is his thinking about being a propaganda stunt, or both?
No, well, the initial thought was they get back in and attack Singapore and then get back home safely, and they would trumpet to the world that the Japanese were not invincible. Lyon was absolutely furious that Singapore had been lost. I mean, he was a real empire man. I think he took it as a personal insult that the British had actually lost Singapore. And with Reynolds, they concocted this very loose plan, which when eventually Lyon got out of Sumatra with a very hair-raising adventure and turned up in India, he went to see General Wavell, who supported the plan, and also Lyon met up with Bill Reynolds, who'd also managed to escape right across the Indian Ocean in his little boat, which he'd now renamed Kite. Now, originally it was the Kofuku Maru, which is the Japanese name, and then they couldn't have that for a name, of course, so he called it Kite after a venomous little snake that lives in the Far East, and it's very cunning. It lies in the dust, and when you tread on it, you get a dose of venom which will kill you. And the analogy was that this little nondescript boat, just like the little nondescript snake, would deliver a blow to the Japanese. And that was the whole story. I mean, it was quite romantic sort of story, but this is their thinking behind it.
And this is important because there's a tendency these days to measure special operations by their destructive success, so to speak. But actually, at this part of the war, 41, 42, 43, part of the success of a mission like this is actually the propaganda element. It's look at the Doolittle raid, because there's a similarity in my head between what we're talking about today and the Doolittle raid, in that the actual effect in the bombing of Tokyo was minimal. The fact that most of those American B-25 crews got lost on the way back is less important than the strike that the Americans are said that they are going right into the heart of Japan and they're bombing Tokyo. And the same can be said about Operation Jaywick. It's not whether or not you get 1 ship, 10 ships, blow up this, blow up that. It's the fact you can do it. The Japanese at this point in the war are in lots of places around the Far East, and if an Allied force can hit them in one of their important home bases out of nowhere, it could potentially send panic throughout the Japanese Navy and Army. And that sense of fear, it can be as important or more important than the destruction of, for example, shipping. And that's important, I think, to establish that the motivation for a raid is not just its destructive element. Is that fair to say, Lynette?
Well, yes, because they didn't know, of course, at this stage what they could target. But in the end, the maximum number of ships they could target was only 9. That was three per group, 2 men in each foal boat, and there were 3 foal boats. The maximum was 9. In the end, they put limpets on 7, and 6 went off. But it didn't really matter what they attacked, as long as they attacked something, and they could get back home safely and then crow to the world what they'd done, because that would have put the Japanese into a panic. They had a very large empire they're trying to hang on to. Troops would have been drawn from all over the place to defend all their little ports and big ports around the place. And the whole idea was one of to strike fear into them, and propaganda, and also to raise the spirits of the Allies at a time when things were not going terribly well.
Yeah. So we talked about this holy trinity of Reynolds and Lyon, but now there's a plan. But getting a plan like this off the ground and saying we're going to take an old Japanese boat hundreds of miles into Singapore, it's going to take a bit of assistance from up above to get this plan into operation. So how complicated was it for Lyon to sell this plan to the powers that be, and how difficult was it for him to assemble a team, and how did he assemble that team?
Well, he had plans of doing it from India. And so when he went there, he went to see Wavell. And of course, SOE India had been set up there, and that would have been quite easy. But Wavell said it would have much more chance of success if they went from Australia. So that meant bringing the Kite all the way from India, which eventually did, to Australia, and for Lyon to come out and to organise his team out in Australia. He turned up with a letter of recommendation from General Wavell, but didn't cut any ice with the senior army officer in Australia. Didn't want to know about it. The Americans didn't come into their plans, and he was sort of pushed from pillar to post until he went to the person who was going to help him, which was the Director of Naval Intelligence in Australia, a friend of Emerson Elliott, and also MI6's man in Australia. Now, his name was Commander Long, and he had set up the Coast Watching organisation in Australia. He knew a great deal about SOE because he was in fact connected to MI6, and he said that he would back the plan, which is why all the people originally chosen to go on Jaywick, apart from Lyon and his offsider Taffy Morris, who was Welsh, were all from the Royal Australian Navy. So at this point, Operation Jaywick was actually an SOE Australia RAN mission, and in that sense, it has unique status. It has unique status because it was in the mind of one man who planned it. It had total backing from the Royal Australian Navy and nobody else. And it had financial backing from SOE in London, which sent vast amounts of money to a secret bank account in a suburb of Sydney called King's Cross, which is the red light district. And money went there to the Bank of New South Wales to fund it. And with that money, they rented a flat, an ordinary flat nearby, which was their headquarters. So it wasn't in a military establishment. This was all done really with almost like civilian thinking, but backed by the Navy. And from there, they chose people from the naval base to go to a special training camp, which was a one-off camp, which Lyon set up in a remote part of Sydney on Refuge Bay, just to the north of Sydney, on the Hawkesbury River. And they called it Camp X. In some books, you'll see it's called Camp Z. People have a fixation with this Z business, but it was really Camp X.
And I got a little bit confused when I was doing my preparation the last few days, going, is this Camp X or Camp Z? And I kept having to go back to your website because I knew that would be correct. And I kind of blow my brain apart, then go back into it again, because as I said at the beginning, there is lots of misinformation out there. And talking about misinformation, there's the Kite arriving there. Is this photo here is regularly cited, even on Australian War Memorial, as being a full boat? It's not, is it? So what are we looking at there?
No, this is what they called an experimental canoe, which was made of plywood. And it was made by Freddie Marsh and the second in command, Donald Davidson, because they were getting a bit bored waiting for Kite to arrive from India. It was delayed for lots of reasons, and it was very late. And they got a bit bored. So Freddie Marsh and Donald Davidson decided to make this experimental canoe. And for a joke, they christened it HMAS Lyon. And you can just see the name on the right-hand side there. Yep. And it was launched by the Governor-General as a joke when he came down to visit the training camp. So it's an experimental canoe. It was very unmanoeuvrable. You needed a space as big as the Sydney Harbour to turn it around, but it's often cited as a foal boat, and it definitely isn't. A foal boat was made of light bamboo frame with waterproof canvas stretched over the top of it, and you could unpack it and pack it up. You can't unpack this thing.
Yeah. And this is the point we should say, viewers, that the Kite is only to take this force to a certain distance away from Singapore, several miles away. And the final leg, the final covert bit of the operation, is full boats, and then with limpet mines into the harbour to destroy shipping. And we'll get to that point of the story a little bit later. But these are photos taken at Camp X of the tent, and it is I've looked at it on Google Earth. It's an incredibly beautiful, picturesque area with waterfalls and rocks and lagoons, and it looks, at least on Google Earth, to be really beautiful. I'm sure there are nasty, creepy, crawly things there as well, and it's got its own hazards, but it looks really beautiful. And that's where they just set about their training of commando techniques, destruction, for putting physical fitness, all that kind of thing that you would expect with special forces. And at this point, the men who you say they're mostly Royal Australian naval volunteers. Do they know what the mission is? Obviously, Lyon knows, and you mentioned Davidson. The men who are signing up for this, do they know what they're taking part in yet?
No, they only know it's a hazardous mission. They don't know where they're going, and they had to practice, of course, putting limpet mines on, all that sort of thing, sneaking up on ships. That in that previous photograph there were a couple of warships that were Australian, and they used those for exercises, and were so good that they actually got on board and won the exercise without anybody on board, even though they were told to look out for them. Seeing them come, they were wearing black japara, or like a kind of a suit, and blackened their faces, and with knitted hats on. They learned how to paddle silently with a single paddle, and then how to get close to the warships and get on board. And they were exceptionally well trained. The training was fantastic. And in this photograph here, you can see they're attacking the bag of chaff with commando knives. They had special knives, knuckle duster type knives, which were supplied by SOE in England. So they had all those bits and pieces that SOE was using was made available to them.
And here, folks, is a memorial at Refuge Bay that, as we now know, folks, because you've been watching the show and listening to Lynette, that it's got the wrong insignia on it. It's got the whole Z reference again there. But we now know that next time you find yourself in Refuge Bay, folks, you can go up there and you can tut your head and go, I know that's wrong there. But it's an interesting rabbit hole in that there are monuments. I said to Lynette before we went live, there are monuments in Normandy that have mistakes. There are monuments in Arnhem and Market Garden. There are monuments around the world. And unfortunately, when something becomes quote unquote set in stone on a monument, it then becomes an established part of history, and then books get written about it. And it's important to understand that as we read books and we look at websites, we watch YouTube, that don't take everything you are looking at as being gospel truth. Sometimes it is. Sometimes I try and bring the right people on this show who actually absolutely know their stuff. And I think you trust me now to bring the right people in. But yeah, there is some misinformation about this. So the operation itself, we just talked about some of the people there. So this is the group of men there. So explain who we're looking at there. And I mean, Major Lyon minus his tash is there, second from left there. But who else is in that photo?
Well, these are the original. This is from the original plan. One on the left is a fellow called Gort Chester, who was a member of MI6. Then we have Lyon looking there. The next one's Bill Reynolds, because he was supposed to go on the Jaywick raid. I mean, this is how rum this outfit was. Here we have an Australian civilian being allowed to go on a highly secret military mission, which is, unheard of. The next one is Donald Davidson, who was the 2IC. And the last one on the right is a fellow called Bert Overall, who was going to do some demolition on installations on land. And the plan got changed. So in the end, only two of the people in that photograph actually went. That was Lyon, second from the left, and Davidson, second from the right.
And there is Davidson, who just with the monocle there, which was something of his look. And we've got to bring in Ted Cars there on the right, because he is an interesting figure, absolutely part of this operation. But for reasons you'll explain later on, he kind of gets involved in the post-war, how should we call it, the adjustment of the history a little bit in terms of books, things like that. So how did Cars come into the story?
Well, Bill Reynolds left the mission because it was very delayed. I mean, the engine broke down. It looked like Jaywick was never going to happen. So the Americans knew a good man when they saw one. So they recruited him to the United States Bureau of Economic Warfare, which was a kind of a SOE type thing. And he was sent up into the Far East on a mission for the Americans, and unfortunately was caught by the Japanese and was executed. So to replace him, he had this great knowledge of the Far East. He was a master mariner. They needed somebody to navigate the Crite on its way to Singapore. And a fellow called Cars, who's the fellow on the right, had been to the Naval Training School with Commander Long. And he'd had a sort of not terribly good life. He was an unreformed alcoholic, and, sort of one job to another. And Long decided that if he gave him a chance, maybe he'd make something of him. And against Emerson Elliott's advice, who was very much against it, Cars was added to the Jaywick team in about August of 1943. The mission was terribly delayed. It was supposed to take place on the 15th of February, which was the anniversary of the fall of Singapore. But the Crite coming late from India, and then having engine trouble and all this other stuff that went on, the whole mission got very delayed, and the modus operandi slightly changed, and the crew changed. 3 or 4 people were replaced. And in the end, there were a couple of Australian Army people on board, because 2 of the sailors had gone.
And during this problem, I mean, the problems of the Cripe, well, there's more details in your books, of course, but it's got engine problems. It's not the most reliable boat in the world. Is there any possibility of this whole operation being scrapped? Because a boat that isn't reliable, it kind of hinges on that boat going a very, as we'll see the map later, folks, it's got to go a long way to get anywhere near Singapore. Did Lyon and the others have to fight to maintain this operation with all the delays? I mean, was it ever close to being cancelled?
Oh yes, that was in sort of just on the back burner for a while. Fortunately, Emerson Elliott, through his connections, managed to get a new engine, which he put his finger on, and the engine was sent up to Townsville to replace the one that had collapsed. But they were still very worried about this whole mission at headquarters, and there was another mission, a similar sort of mission going to take place in New Guinea, and it had to be one or the other. And eventually Jaywick was chosen because the people from the other mission carried out a dummy raid on shipping in Townsville in North Queensland, and showed that a small group of men in foal boats could approach vessels in a guarded harbour and put limpet mines on the vessels. Now, the limpet mines were dummies, but when they were discovered when the tide went down, it created huge panic in North Queensland because they thought that they'd been mined, and they proved the point, and Operation Jaywick was back on track.
And this is a team photo there, all looking rather stern in that photo. Interestingly,
yes, very very stern. You'll see the majority of them are sailors, and there's the fellow with the tartan trews on is Jock Campbell, who was involved in the planning with Lyon. He was MI6 as well, and SOE Far East, and he ended up actually being the head of Special Operations Australia in the end.
And they end up with a cook, don't they? Then Army cook joins them now, and I'm gonna incur your wrath, Lynette, there by mentioning the TV series with Paul Rees and Jason Donovan. But in the TV show, Major Lyon is portrayed as being very superstitious, and in the TV show, they add the cook because if they hadn't added the cook, it would have been a 13-man team on the mission, and he wanted to be 14, not 13, because 13 was superstitious. Any truth in that, or is it all complete Hollywood nonsense?
No, rubbish. They needed a cook because the old cook had gone. So
I knew you were going to say that. I just thought I'd ask that anyway. But that's the thing. These things that get rooted there, and Cars, I think, so Cars is bottom left there. The fact he was an unreformed alcoholic and he does survive the war, and some of the story from his point of view goes off on some tangents, and Lyon, as we'll find out later, didn't survive the war. So, and neither did Davidson, neither did Bob Page. Bob Page is in the bottom right there. So Cars ended up being kind of the only senior figure involved in this who was alive to tell the tale, and therefore the survivor gets to tell it the way they want to, I guess, is that what happened, I suppose.
Yeah, while we're looking at Lyon, I mean, one of the most enduring myths about Lyon is that he concocted both these plans because his wife and child were in Japanese hands in Singapore. I mean, they never were. His wife Gabrielle and his baby escaped to Australia, and they were going to stay here. And then Lyon was over in India at that stage and said, "Well, come over here. I've arrived." They set off from Australia in a ship, which disappeared in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Now, at this stage, Lyon had already had Jaywick well on the being planned. He thinks his family's dead. Kept on with the mission, carried it on, then started to plan the next one, and eventually in 1944 discovered that the ship they were on had been intercepted by a German raider, and they were in fact safely in Japan. But this story continues that Lyon planned Jaywick and Operation Rimau with some mad idea of rescuing his wife and child from enemy hands, and it's just enduring. It's almost impossible to get rid of.
I know, and this is that thing about once a myth gets established, it's just very, very, very hard to derail it. We get it all the time. It's come up so often on this channel. But here we have a map for those who are less familiar with this part of the world, and I include myself in this. There's Australia's on bottom right, and at the top left is Singapore, part of what was then Malaya. So to get the Cripe all the way there, it's a long journey in the first place, but also talk us about the difficulty of getting through the Lombok Strait, because that's a key integral part of the success of the mission. And why was that so perilous?
Well, the Lombok Strait has a very fast tidal race because the water from the Java Sea channels through in between those two, Bali on the left and Lombok on the right. And they would have been all right, except Kars, the navigator, made a mistake in the navigation and headed to the left of Bali instead of the right of Bali. You can see that dogleg there.
Yeah.
And when that happened, they missed the tide. So they reached this the Lombok Strait with the tide running out towards them instead of them going through with the tide. And it took ages. I mean, the Krite was not a very fast little ship. And that sometimes they were basically only holding their own, sometimes going backwards. And that was really, really perilous. It was a very difficult part of the journey. And it was with great relief that they went through the Lombok Strait and then headed more or less across to the island south of Singapore, totally unmolested. They looked like they had a Japanese flag flying off the stern, which had been made in Melbourne by the wife of one of the SOE people. And they got there unmolested and was very plain sailing. It was very boring. They said it was a very boring journey.
But I mean, as you said, it could have gone, because this disguise of dressing as disguising itself as a Japanese fishing vessel, it's kind of only works at long distance. If for any reason some kind of Japanese patrol craft or something got close and really wanted to investigate this, given the amount of supply, because this boat is seriously overloaded with men, with the explosives, the limpet mines, the full boats, all the food they need, all the fuel they need. And let's face it, most Australian sailors are not going to pass themselves off as non-Australian folk. So you're playing down there may not have actually been much danger, because in the end it went quite smoothly. But the thing is, the potential things that can go wrong are huge, isn't it? Because it's hundreds of miles to go. So how much time was allocated for this mission?
They left in it was 5. I think they were gone for 6 weeks. I should look that up exactly. But with the reason why they weren't molested was because the plan was so good. They had these flags made. They looked like a rundown, filthy Japanese fishing boat. When the ship had been over in India, the very enthusiastic people at the dockyard there had cleaned it up, and when it arrived in Fremantle on board a merchant vessel, Emerson Elliott had gone down and said, "This won't do. It looks far too good. It'll have to be roughed up." So they made it look more down at heel, and with the flag out the back, and with anybody on deck made to wear a disguise, even though it wouldn't have stood up to close scrutiny by any means. They had native style sarongs on, and they put a dye all over their bodies, which was made by Helene Rubinstein, the cosmetics company. Stung like crazy. And of course, it didn't do much for the people with blonde hair. It looked a bit ridiculous. But from a distance, they would have, if they'd been seen, they should have got away with it. And although it was very perilous, they did it because they thought ahead, and they looked like what they were supposed to be, just a worn out old Japanese fishing boat.
And these photos, folks, are all taken on the journey there. There's Lyon again there.
Lyon.
And it is interesting. Clearly this isn't taken when they're right in enemy water. This is kind of on the way there. But I like to look at the photos and faces of people in these photos. I've done a lot of these shows, and sometimes you can see stress on people's faces. You can see that the burden of command, the burden of responsibility. These guys, most of the photos, they look pretty relaxed, don't they? Which is evident, when you say that the journey there was unmolested. It's fairly uneventful, apart from getting through the strait there, because they do look pretty relaxed on his photos. Is that your interpretation as well?
Oh yeah, they went fishing. I mean, they said it was boring. It was very, very boring. Very boring journey, which is lucky, of course. And here's a couple more pictures here of the.
And that photo is important, folks. Remind ourselves, these are heavily armed commandos. They would have to do their routine maintenance of their weapons, checking them, keeping them on. Even though they're not expecting to use the submachine guns, the full boats will be going in with just pistols. They need to prepare themselves for the the unforeseen circumstance of having to fight it out somewhere. And so they've got Sten guns and Owen guns and Bren guns and the whole lot there, and the fighting knives and the explosives. So there's lots of photos of that. Now, this is an important photo. This is Ivan Lyon on one of the islands. So we're getting closer to Singapore now. So where is he at this point?
Well, at this point, this is actually after the raid. He's on an island called Dongas, and I've actually stood on that very spot, and it had a high vantage point, and he's looking through his telescope at the damage that they've wrought against the shipping in Singapore.
Right.
And you can see he's very, very lean in that photograph, and he was quite a wiry sort of person, but a fantastic leader. And with the next raid, I know we shouldn't be getting into that, but a very, very tough Australian commando who was to go on that mission wrote home before he left on that mission and said, "I'm going on a mission. I can't tell you where it is, but we have a leader for whom we would all be willing to die." Now, this is an Australian soldier saying this about an English officer. You'll realise the importance of that statement and just how revered Ivan Lyon was by the men under his command. He was an amazingly charismatic and an absolutely brilliant soldier.
And driven as well. I mean, highly motivated as well. Now, when you said that the plan was perfect and lots have gone into that is absolutely true, of course. But when they get closer to Singapore, do they know exactly when they head off which island they're going to try and hold up at and use the full boats from, or are they doing a certain amount of reconnaissance because they don't know which ones the Japanese might be patrolling or using? How much of that last bit of the plan is down to Lyon and Cars to improvise when they get there?
Well, Cars is out of the picture by this stage.
Yeah.
They all left the Crite back at a island called Padjang, which was right down near the Lingga archipelago. And from there, they took off in their foal boats, weaving their way through the islands of the Rio archipelago to a little island they picked out in advance that they were going to use for their reconnaissance. And when they got there, they found that their view of Singapore harbour was completely blocked by a little pimple type bit of island called Hill 160, and they couldn't see. So they had to then go to another island in front, which is called Suba, which is the closest island. It had absolutely no shade at all. It was stinking hot. It was covered in low bracken. They nearly died of the heat. But from that island with the telescope, they sussed out how many ships there were or could be attacked and where they could head and do the most damage. So that was the island they went to. The island that was with the telescope was the island they had their rendezvous at the end, and it was quite high, and that's where they sat and waited it out until it was dark and they could escape back and make their way back to the Crite.
And this is a genuine foal boat there, and you can see, folks, just how much stuff they've got to take in this, because it's the limpet mines, it's the explosives, obviously the paddles, it goes without saying, because they're leaving the Crite for an expected, is it 5 or 6 days on their own?
Yeah. Oh, yes. They're a while. It takes them 2 or 3, and then they've got the mission. Then they've got to get back. Yes, they got 2 weeks altogether. Wow.
So they've got to be self-sufficient with that. Behind enemy lines, we should stress at this point there, in a little, 12-foot long boat, whatever it is, and then paddle into Singapore. So here's the map, the close-up map of where we're talking about. So anyone who knows that part of the world, so Singapore is up there, huge, great harbour, Empire Dock, what have you. And here are the various islands around here, and they break the mission down to 3 full boats, each with a 2-man crew, but they're not going to the same part. They've got 3 separate little missions they're then undertaking. So explain, and how was it decided who got what, by the way? Because in this point, am I correct in saying Davidson is in charge, because the Navy guy is in charge of the actual full boat, but Lyon is the overall mission commander. In terms of the raid, Davidson takes seniority, is that correct?
No, Lyon was always in control. Davidson was always the 2IC, but he was in charge of the training.
Right.
And,
but who makes the calls on things like tides and because Davidson is the Navy guy, Lyon is the Army guy. I mean, obviously they're a harmonious team, but who defers to who in these? It's always Lyon has the decision.
Davidson's not really Navy. He was up in Burma with a teak company before the war. He was put in the Navy as his cover. What they did was they put people in the Navy and gave them commissions. So it's Lyon who's the one that's the military man. And I'll just make a correction there. At the bottom of that map that's there, it says Pula something, I can't see, it's Ketchel, Hill 120. That's where they were supposed to go. And it was Subar, the one in front, that was blocking their view, even though it was only about as big as a pill to look at. It was blocking their view. So they went to Subar to do their reconnaissance. And from there, they, as you can see with the telescope, they can see all the way into Singapore and also the roads and the area there. And they picked out their various targets. So there were 3 officers, and they each had a rating, able seaman with them. The only AIF fellow was Page, who'd replaced somebody else. You had Davidson, who was RAN, and also Lyon, who was Navy, and the other 3 were sailors.
And the Crite is way back, moving around, keeping out of the way, hoping that this. And I mean, it must stress, but they have no communication with each other. So the Cars is giving Lyon a certain amount of time, or Lyon has given Cars a certain amount of time, and then the rendezvous will happen, all being well, if this mission goes. So, I mean, you're saying how well planned it is, but there's a lot of fine tuning that will have to work. And things can go wrong. What if there's weather conditions? What if there's illness? What if there's a lot hanging on this? It's a testament to their bravery and their fortitude how this plan is put together with so many variables and so many loose ends that may end up going wrong. So we have three full boats going after 3 locations, and so what date are we talking about for this the actual raid?
The 26th of September, and Lyon was the one with all the knowledge of the waters around Singapore. He had a little yacht called the Lynette, and he had sailed that all over the place. He knew Singaporean waters backwards. So, you know, he was the person to know. But he because he was in control, he could fine-tune the plan as he went. The original plan was to hide the Crite in the Kampar River estuary in Sumatra. And then he decided that might be a bit difficult, and then changed the plan for it to go wandering aimlessly off the waters south of Borneo and just pretend to be a fishing boat. So as he went along, he adjusted his plan. He wasn't locked into anything solid. And that's probably the beauty of this whole mission, was that because he was in total control, he was the man on the spot. He could make the adjustments, and he had sufficient military background to know what he was actually doing. So yes, you can see the 3 groups have gone off there and where they've attacked. The solid line is Davidson and Falls, who went right up into the harbour at Singapore, right in, so close that they could hear the chimes on the Victoria clock striking the hour and 1 o'clock, and realised that they would have to get going. So they went in there then and attacked those ships out on the right in the roads, and then went back a very long way down through the Riau Straits. The other 2 foal boats parties, as you can see from the dotted lines, went more or less together and attacked ships in roughly the same area, and then retreated to Dongus, which is where Lyon sat with the telescope to see what had happened. And they all made it back before the first explosions were heard. And this is
I need just a colour photo, a map. I just to kind of make it a little bit easier to kind of identify the main blocks of, Indonesia there, Malaya as it was there, Singapore there, and clearly Lyon's knowledge of that area was vital. But that last night, there's a lot they've got to cover, a lot of distance in full boats. There's a lot of the pressure is on. It's not like a leisurely paddle in. They're up against it because of tides, because of darkness. So the raid itself is as well planned as it was. There's a huge element of stress behind it, and these are a couple of painting. We don't have any photos, folks, of the actual raid itself, but these are photos by Australian war artist Dennis Adams there. So how did the actual raid itself go without any hiccups, or were there hiccups along the way?
Well, there were no hiccups as such, but there could have been. I mean, they were very lucky. I mean, that there were searchlights. At one stage, they were putting limpets on. I mean, the limpets actually make a noise. They're magnetic, and you've got to lower them down with
like a broomstick, haven't you? Kind of below the level of the water, and then kind of release it. But when it clanks onto the metal there, if someone was the other side of that part of the hull, and they maybe hear that clank, and that you can't do it silently. It's incredible.
So at one stage they were right underneath, and a crewman put his head out the window having a cigarette and looked out, and they were sure they'd been seen, but they hadn't. So they had a huge element of luck. I mean, luck was really with them. You've got to say that. But it was extremely hair-raising and very, very stressful, as you can imagine. These little tiny fall boats, going up these ships, finding their targets, trying to stay in the shadows and the darkness, putting on the limpets, and then hoping to goodness that you got out of the area and could get back to the safety of Dongus Island. We had to wait there the whole day, of course, until night fell.
To go on the
They
next
couldn't
day.
paddle around in the daytime.
And I suppose an advantage they do have is if the Japanese are expecting something in Singapore, they're not expecting this, and this is too small. It's that kind of. That's exactly what Special Forces Commando. They've got nets and things for submarines. They've got anti-aircraft guns about enemy bombers. The last thing they're expecting is 3 little full boats just coming in from a neighboring island. So I suppose they have got that on their side, that this is the unexpected. But it doesn't mean I would be any keen on doing this raid myself. But here we come to the deal, because you said earlier on they had seen 9 ships in the harbours, but they only managed to get near. So run through exactly how many limpet mines they put on ships and exactly what happened next.
Well, they were going to mine 9 ships with 3 on each. That's 27. But when Lyon got over to his target, now you must remember they're looking at these targets from a very long distance. Davidson's only making kind of guesses of what the ships are and the class they are from an identification manual. So, it's very long distance. When they got there, some of the ships had moved, and Lyon and his partner couldn't find theirs in the dark, and so they went for a tanker. Now, a tanker's multi-compartmented, so they had to put all of their limpets on the tanker to make sure it sank. So they just had the one target. The others had their normal ones, they're 3 each, which made 7 that were limpeted. Now, these pictures here are actually of 2 that were sunk, and for a very, very long time, we've worked on the basis that Davidson was identifying these targets, and they assumed that that's what had been attacked. But work done by a researcher who was very, very into Japanese records and can read them, tracked down and found out which ships had actually been attacked. And we've discovered that 6 explosions went off, 1 didn't, and that the tonnage was less than what was claimed in the end, and that of the 6 attacked, 2 only remained sunk. Now, don't take that as a suggestion that this raid wasn't successful, because it was a propaganda raid. Didn't matter what they attacked, as long as they attacked something. And so that didn't matter. But of course, people have always been, going on about the tonnage sunk and all this sort of stuff. And this has been around, and 7 ships were sunk, and this is the tonnage. Well, no, we've now got into Japanese records, and we know which ships were there and which weren't. So these are just pictures of 2 of them.
But the interesting thing is, and there's more on your website, and I urge people to go in and read all the amazing articles on Lynette's website later on, folks. The link is in the description below, and of course get her book on the Singapore raids. Is that, unfortunately, as we established at the beginning, a key part of this mission is the need to, once it's been successful, to tell the world that this is a propaganda shot. The problem is, though, that couldn't happen. This is the real essential part of the story, is because the Japanese don't think that this has been achieved by the way it was achieved. They think something else has happened. And so to explain what the Japanese wake up to 2 ships up, but what do they think has happened?
Well, the explosions are going off, over the early hours of the morning, and they're running around all over the place. The searchlights going off, and planes are, taking off, and ships are everywhere. And the Japanese conclude that never in their wildest dreams do they think this is from the outside. I mean, this is so far deep into enemy territory, and Singapore is so well defended by the Japanese. They never for 1 minute can consider that it could possibly be anybody from the outside. So they deduce that it has been masterminded by British, who are locked up in the Changi jail, civilians, and that they have managed to get local people to carry it out. So on the 10th of October, the 10th day of the 10th month, a purge started that has gone down in infamy as the Double 10th Massacre. And at that point, the Japanese swooped on the hapless local population. They went down to the jail. They arrested all these British people. They arrested hundreds of Chinese, tortured them. Of the 46 civilians in the jail that were arrested on suspicion of being involved, 16 didn't survive the torture. Now, the bloodbath was shocking. The Chinese were beheaded after terrible tortures, and after months and months and months of investigation, the Kempeitai or secret police was still no closer to finding out who'd done this, because they couldn't find out. Now, the reason they couldn't find out was that we were intercepting Japanese signals. And almost immediately after the raid was over, and that Lyon had just arrived back in Australia, they all got back safely. The higher-ups, of course, who had access to these signals, realised that the Japanese didn't know what had hit them. They also realised that the locals were taking the rap. So a decision was made, we are going to keep this secret. We might want to do other raids like this. And at that point, Ivan Lyon went absolutely ballistic, because the whole idea of his raid was for propaganda purposes. And now it was going to be kept a secret from the world. It wasn't going to raise morale. It wasn't going to demoralise on our side. It wasn't going to demoralise the Japanese on the enemy side. And so Jaywick was kept a secret, and nobody knew anything about it until the war had ended. Well, the downside was this dreadful, dreadful bloodbath, which was taking place in Singapore. And this is the way of war. I mean, Ivan Lyon once said, war is a very grim business, and it is. And one of those grim things was that these people were collateral damage. That's not to say they've been forgotten in Singapore. People in there are very aware of what happened, and I've met people over there whose relatives have been hideously tortured in an attempt by the Japanese to find out who'd done it.
And that is exactly why this show has ended up being part of South Asia and Southeast Asia History Week, because that has been the recurring theme of, for example, we talked about last night, the widows of Indian soldiers killed in World War II didn't usually get the pension that a British war widow would have received, unless their husband happened to have been a Victoria Cross recipient. So this is what we're trying to get across, the impact on the lives of ordinary people. Because there's a photo of the celebration mission. We can talk about the return leg back in a minute, Lynette, but there's the celebration there. But until the post-war rediscovery of this story, until the books, until the miniseries, as you said, the whole benefit of this had to be kept secret. So they did a fantastic job. Ivan Lyon was an incredible hero. This was well planned. They destroy 2 ships and damage others, and yet the whole thing has to be kept quiet. So that's a paradoxical kind of sad ending to this story there. But I just said we ought to talk about the return leg, because this is where Davidson and a misidentification of ships. Because folks, imagine whether you're on the Kite or whether you're on a follow boat, you're now been at sea for 5 or 6 weeks, and you're seeing a ship across gauging distance. Now, if you're on a proper ship, you can use various instruments and stereoscopic things to work out distance, but just looking at binoculars across, recognizing a ship and identifying it is very difficult, because in the conventional histories about this, Lynette, they were monitored, approached, whatever you want to call it, by a Japanese destroyer on the way back. So let's bust that myth. What Japanese vessel did they have an encounter with on the return leg?
Well, they entered the Lombok Strait after a very
this dangerous strait we talked about.
Yes, after a very uneventful voyage. They said if it was boring going over, it was even more boring coming back. But they were in for a bit of excitement when they saw what they believed to be some sort of patrol boat approaching. You could see the white water from the front of the bow. Davidson was trying to identify it from his Japanese identification book, and thought it might be minesweeper number 17, which is the top photograph there.
Yeah.
After the war, with the writing of the first book on this subject, which was really factionalized, it turned into a destroyer, and it's been a destroyer ever since. And when I asked one of the crew members there, why did you think it was a destroyer? He said, well, I was so terrified I thought it was a destroyer. Anyway, it was supposed to be a minesweeper 17, and I believe that until quite recently, until the same fellow who was able to identify the ships in Singapore Harbour, he'd done a lot of work, got into the Japanese records and found out exactly who was on duty and who was patrolling the Lombok Strait. And it was a very, very small little boat that had belonged to the Dutch and was over in Batavia, the port for Batavia, when the Japanese arrived, and was captured. It had been built as a dispatch vessel, and then the Dutch had hurriedly decided they probably should have it for a minesweeper because things were getting very difficult. And it was there, it was captured, and it was captured by the Japanese and put into service. Now, the original name of this boat was FAK, which is an Indonesian name, and if it's pronounced properly, it is pronounced fuck.
Yeah,
and I
we
say
can swear on the channel. It's fine. We can swear.
When I sell this story, which is precisely, I think, what the Jaywick crew said when they saw it coming.
Yeah.
Now, it was much, much smaller.
Yeah, I should apologise, folks. I should have made that photo smaller to make the scale better, because it makes, in the way I put the two photos, it makes it like they're equivalent size. They're not. This old Dutch boat is much, much more. But this, I guess, confirms what I'm saying about looking across the crate and seeing a boat there. If you can't determine distance, how big is that vessel you're seeing? Especially, as we said, you know, you're 5 weeks or something into a mission there. You haven't exactly been sleeping well. You've had a lot of stress going on. You can completely understand where some misidentification happens. But yeah, they did encounter a Japanese vessel, but it wasn't a destroyer, which we've now established. So, back to the celebration. So these are the photos we have of Lyon and Paige and Davidson all celebrating this. But how, and we are going to have Lynette back at some point in the future and talk about the follow-up raid, and we will just basically kind of run over that very quickly in a few minutes for you. But how much of the fact that the information from this couldn't be released to the public is what motivates Lyon to want to get back in there again? If this had been able to make the newspapers, if this had been, do you think Lyon would have left this operation behind him and moved on to something else? Or, but the fact it wasn't publicized, does that kind of drive him even more to do something more again?
Well, it was by the time they'd come back from this Jaywick raid, and it was proved to be very successful, that motivated all the people who had been, you know, not terribly interested to be very interested. So they set up a Commando School at Fraser Island with the whole idea of expanding this whole production to have many more missions. Now, most of the missions were reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, but one of them was to attack a lot of bases from a base in the where it was in the south of Singapore, in the ocean there, and it was called Operation Hornbill. And one of those operations was going to be Operation Rimau, which was to attack more shipping in Singapore, because while they'd been over there, the Jaywick people had seen large numbers of ships out in the roads, and they actually tried to attack those ships and change their plan, but they were fought back by the tide, and then they had to revert to what they were going to do in any case. But they thought that perhaps if with Rimau, which was bigger and better, they could attack 60 ships. So that was going to be actually a sabotage raid, whereas Operation Jaywick was for propaganda purposes.
Yeah.
But if it had been propaganda purposes, of course, there wouldn't have been an Operation Rimau because the cat was out of the bag.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but Rimau basically, it's not quite an unmitigated disaster, but it goes badly wrong, and we can come and talk about that in the future with it. But you know, and the tragedy is that Lyon and Paige and Davidson and some of the able seamen do not survive the second raid, and we're happy to have you back on and talk about that in the future. But with regards to Operation Jaywick, which is what we're talking about today, what annoys you most as a historian about the way the narrative is still told on the majority of internet sites and in the books? You know, what are the, I mean, we've cleared up some of the myths today, but what annoys you about the way it's reported still?
Well, with the miniseries, one of the things that really annoys me is the way that Lyon is portrayed. Some of them is shown as a man living on the edge of his nerves, highly superstitious, you know, intent on rescuing his wife from Singapore, some sort of loony British major. And he was cool as a cucumber in a crisis. I've met people who knew him very well. And he was a consummate soldier, and he certainly knew what he was doing. So that, from a personal point of view, my most annoyance comes from the way that he is actually been portrayed over the years. The others, of course, is all the hoo-ha we get about all that mythology we've been talking about. But what is quite sobering is that it took me until 2003 to force the issue over the price that was paid for Operation Jaywick in Singapore. Until then, people involved didn't want to know. They didn't want to know the downside. They didn't want to know that all these people had suffered terribly because of what we'd done. And it was insulting to the people in Singapore because they knew about it. And it was eventually in 2003, on the 60th anniversary, I was able to force the issue with the Australian Army, who had never heard about it, and said this has to be rectified. And so I'm glad to say that at the celebrations and at the memorial services held in Sydney, due reverence was paid to the people of Singapore, for which the people of Singapore were very, very grateful. And I received a visit from the High Commissioner for Singapore to thank me personally for ensuring that at long last, what had happened to their people as a result of this raid, which has always been almost an old boy's own annual kind of life, now had the other side of the story, so it was balanced. And to reinforce that, an expert was brought out from Singapore for that celebration during that week, and he shared the podium with me on a very big lecture stage. And I told about the story of the planning and the execution, how clever it was, how brilliant it was, and he talked about the downside. And you could have heard a pin drop from these people who were really into this sort of story. Never heard anything about it before, which is really really bad from our point of view, that we've gone on for years, big noting ourselves and saying how wonderful this raid was, which it was, but we've been very, very remiss in ignoring the price that's paid in war with the lives of quite often very ordinary, very innocent people.
Yeah, and that we had Tragedies and Disasters Week last week on World War II TV, and we talked about Lidice in Czechoslovakia and how that is, of course, a result of the assassination of Heydrich, and we talked about things in Norway where the Shetland line, where they were getting agents back and forth from Norway to England. The Gestapo found about it, massacre a village. That unfortunately, when you start getting involved in what we would call special operations, there is this, as you called it, this collateral damage, this effect it happened on the people who are living there. And I have to say, until I'd read your book and we're reading over your website, I'd kind of forgotten a little bit the impact on Singapore. And I think that was very, if we've done one important thing in today's show, it's that acknowledging the loss of life and the torture and the arrests and the roundup in Singapore, because it doesn't, and we're not accusing Ivan Lyon of being an anti-hero. He's an amazing guy. What he did was incredible. It's just setting this operation into the context of the tragedy of World War II and how things affect, because when we did our pre-chat, you said, Lynette, that you're not a military historian so much. You're more interested in people, and whether they happen to be military or civilian, it's about their stories. And that is the greatest story here, is that Lyon himself doesn't survive the war, neither does Davidson, and these people in Singapore who were swept up in reprisal for this. That's a very important story to do. So you say you're still finding information about Operation Jaywick and Rimau. Are there still things that you'd like to sort? Is there still any kind of little questions you have there buzzing around there, or do you think you've kind of answered everything now?
Well, I think if I come back and talk to you about Rimau, finding another eyewitness to what was happening on Meripus Island was absolutely amazing, and that filled in a lot of the question marks that I had in my mind. And with the Jaywick one, finding Dennis and Emerson Elliott, whom I didn't find until 2000, so thereabouts, or after that, I think, and finding out what his involvement was, then allowed me to connect the dots between Lyon and Reynolds and Emerson Elliott, and then some of those bits fell into place because I couldn't work out why the special operations that allowed a civilian he was nearly 50, Reynolds, to go on a mission like this. I mean, when you think about it, it's extraordinary. but that was because he was already on the inside. And the reason, of course, Jaywick was backed so highly was because the command along was the MI6 man in Australia. So when you know all this, it explains a lot of stuff that when I did in my first book wasn't immediately apparent. So, but I don't think now it's too long after the event. I don't think I'm going to find any more witnesses because
there's no more smoking guns, so to speak, to find now. But that, you know, and that's what, you know, I'm so pleased you came on this show, because I think, you know, it's taught me a lesson. I've been doing this for quite a while now, but it's taught me a lesson, because when I have a guest on, I read their book, I look at what they're doing, but I also do my prep on Google as well, because I know that's what my viewers will be doing as well. And over the last few days looking at Jaywick, there's some absolute bollocks on the internet about Jaywick that I now realize is, my God, it's just some ridiculous stuff out there. And it's good to, as we said, to just go back and actually explain the real history. So folks, when we do a Rimau show at some point, it won't be a very nice ending in that one, because there are some very, very nasty things happen, some beheadings and it's not a good end there. But both of these raids and more are covered in Lynette's book, which I thoroughly recommend. The description, as usual, the link is in the description below. So I think we'll bring things to an end. I'll just remind people we've got coming up later. I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So this, don't forget, folks, is the first of 2 shows today. I'm at it again. 6 o'clock UK time tonight. We are bringing you live the Battle of Lafayette in Normandy. So we have 2 cameras out on site near San Mariglis with the incredible American historian Marty Morgan joining. So that'll be 82nd Airborne, 507th, 325th Glider, pushing across the causeway, knocking out tanks, distinguished service crosses, all sorts of things being covered tonight. That'll be great. The weather is perfect in Normandy today, so come back for that. Tomorrow, I did tell you that we had lost a show about the Indian Navy in World War II. I'm still potentially working on a replacement show with an Australian historian again tomorrow, talking about the British-Australian fleet out in the Indian Ocean. That may or may not happen. If it doesn't happen, I just end up with a day off, which isn't a bad thing, because I'm working a lot at the moment, doing a lot, and I'm ragged at both ends. But right now, it remains me to say thank you very much to Lynette Silver for joining us. I knew you'd be a great guest. People watching it. Ernest Malley is one of my Twitter buddies, an Australian historian, is watching it. Great stuff, Paul. Now, Ernest is very hard to please, Lynette, on Twitter. I like Ernest. He's quite cynical. He's seen it all. He's read the books. High praise from him. So that's we've done well. I can go and have my lunch, confident that we've impressed Ernest Malley. So that's been good. So did you enjoy it, Lynette?
Yes, thank you. And a reminder, if people are looking for the Heroes of Rimau, it's been out of print for a long time. But the replacement book is Deadly Secrets, and that covers a lot of the stuff that we've just been through tonight, including Emerson Elliott and some of the mythology we've busted. But the rest of the busting's on my website. Yeah, and it's, I'm glad that you have that website with these resources. There's lots of great stories there. Work about, you know, your projects, taking tours around, righting wrongs, monuments, some great reading there. I spent a lot of time there. So, well, thank you very much, Lynette. Thank you, everybody else, for watching us. I will see you in a few hours' time to Lafayette Show. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV, saying enjoy the rest of your day, or if you're in Australia, enjoy the rest of your evening. So this is Paul Woodadge saying goodbye. Thanks for spending your time with us. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody. Bye.